I think my bad luck is to have to follow Steve. He said he was lowering the bar. It feels to me like he's raised an impossible bar to follow. I never aspired to be a radio personality. People say that an economist is somebody who always wanted to be an accountant but didn't have enough soul. I thought of becoming an accountant, never a radio personality, so forgive me. I'm not going to be a depressing speaker, even though I'm not funny, because I think the message I have to convey to you is, at its core, a profoundly optimistic message. It's that we could literally free up $2 or $3 trillion worth of resources out of thin air just by rearranging the way we do things. If you're interested in this general issue of our panel today, this is the question of whether GDP is a good measure of human welfare, then you've probably already heard about the Easterlin paradox. This is due to Richard Easterlin. The two findings he reported were that when you look at one country at a single point in time and you let income vary up and down the income scale, the poor are much less happy than the rich. There's lots of variance. You'll find lots of happy poor people, some miserable rich people, but the slope of that scatter is very steep. If you then look at a second way of portraying that relationship, if you look at how income and income varies over time, you'll see the time series plot is steeply rising. That's the productivity growth that we're all aware of. But if you look at the average happiness level over time, that's typically flat as a pancake. So why is it that rich people are happier than poor people? Income grows in the cross-section, people get happier. And yet when income grows for everybody over time, people don't get happier. That's the Easterlin paradox. His resolution of it was to say that happiness depends not on how much you have in absolute terms, but on how much you have in relative terms. No matter how much income grows, there are always going to be 10% of us in the bottom 10%, and if that makes you unhappy, then that's not going to change over time as income grows. This thesis has been challenged. There's recent work by Stevenson and Wolfers who say that the reason we didn't see the pattern of income and happiness in the time series was that we didn't have enough data. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, they said in describing that relationship. That work's very contested. I think that it's quite possible that income's rising over time, making us better off in palpable ways, but that's not reflected in the standard happiness measures. Imagine that we've cleaned up pollution because we're richer, we've invested in medical technologies that extend life. How is somebody at age 50 likely to respond to the question, all things considered, how do you feel your life is going these days? I don't think the fact that we're going to die at 85 makes us answer that question any differently from when we were in a society when people died at 75. If you think about going back 100 years, if you had 5 kids, 3 of them would die before they reached the age of 6. There was a lot of agony associated with that. Nobody would say life's not better because now our kids don't die with anything like that frequency. So I think whether or not income growth makes us happier in ways that the social scientists measure, it is, other things equal, a good thing and something that we ought to promote. The title of Easterlin's 1974 paper was, Does Income Growth Improve the Human Lot? And the answer he gave in the paper was no. I think that's the wrong answer. Where I think studying the relationship yields really valuable fruit is if you look at why relative income matters and try to unpack that a little bit more, you learn a lot about why markets often fail to do as much for us as they at least seem to have the potential to do. So the standard economic model, the one that the people Steve interviews all use, says that the utility you get from a good like a house or a suit depends on its absolute qualities. That's patently not the case. It depends on how it compares with other things in the same immediate environment. Context shapes every single evaluation that we make in a profound way. So if your kid asks you, you're on a trip, are we almost there yet? There are 5 miles to go. If the trip is a 6-mile trip and your kid asks you, are we almost there yet? You'll say no. If it's a 300-mile trip and you're 5 miles from your destination, yeah, we're almost there. Is it cold out? I grew up in South Florida on a 60-degree day in November. Is it cold out? We knew the answer. Of course it's cold out. We dressed as warmly as we could. In Helsinki in March on a 60-degree day, is it cold out? They'll think you're stupid for asking that question. It's the same 60 degrees, but there it seems clearly not cold. That's the same framing effect that affects every evaluation we make. Is my house okay? I was a Peace Corps volunteer many years ago in Nepal. I lived in a 2-room house with no electricity or plumbing. Was that house okay? It was absolutely adequate for every purpose that a house needed to serve for me in that context. I would invite people over without any fear of embarrassment. It was a lovely house, actually nicer than the houses of my fellow teachers in the school where I taught. If my friends from Nepal would see the house I live in Ithaca, New York, they would think I had taken complete leave of my senses. Why would anybody need such a grand house? They would want to know. Why so many bathrooms? What's the problem? They would wonder. But most of you would not think that. Most of my friends live in houses more expensive or bigger than mine. It's not noteworthy in that. So context is local. And if you ask the question, how am I doing, which if you don't ask that question, you're not very well equipped to make your way in the world, you need a frame of reference to think about that question, and the local context provides that frame of reference. So that we evaluate how we're doing by saying, how am I doing relative to the relevant local frame of reference is in no way mysterious and in no way indicative of a human failing. If you weren't that way, you'd be defective in a profound sense. Where the fiscal magic comes in when you examine the context relationship a little bit more closely is in the fact that context shapes our evaluations more heavily in some domains than in others. So think about these 2 simple thought experiments. Where would you rather live? World A, where people live in 8,000 square foot houses, 800 meters roughly, or that's where the world, if you live there, you'd live in a neighborhood where your house and the houses of your neighbors would be 8,000. All the other neighborhoods in that world would have 6,000 square feet. So you'd be in a big house in World A, a very big house in absolute terms and in relative terms. Or would you rather live in World B, where your house would be 4,000 square feet, so half as big as in World A, but the houses in other neighborhoods were 3,000 square feet? The standard economic model says there's a uniquely correct answer. That's you should live in the first world because you'd have a bigger house there. But most people, when they think about that question, take a while to think about it, and way more than half indicate that they would pick World B, where they'd have 4,000 square feet, and others would live in neighborhoods with 3,000. That's what I would pick based on my experience in Nepal. I would reason, well, if I lived in World B, I'd be happy with my house. It would seem more than adequate. If I lived in the other house, people wouldn't want their kids to come and play in my neighborhood, or maybe my kids wouldn't go to a school it's thought to be on par with the other schools. So in that experiment, context really reigns supreme. Almost everybody who confronts that question says that they would choose the relatively big house, not the absolutely big. A second thought experiment. You could live in World A. You have a 2 in 10,000 chance of dying on the job this year. 2 in 10,000. Everybody else has a 1 in 10,000 chance of dying on the job. Or you could live in world B, where, world A, I have a 2 in 1 in 10,000 chance of dying on the job. That's a very low, that's the low probability of dying. Everybody else has a higher probability of dying, a 4 in 100,000 chance. Or I could live in world B, where I would have twice the probability of dying, but I would have a relatively low probability of dying on the job. Which would I pick? There, almost everybody picks the world in which the probability of dying would be lower in absolute terms. So context matters for your evaluation of your house much more than it matters for your evaluation of how safe you are in the workplace. And that difference sets up a dynamic that causes people to trade safety for goods in a way that proves extremely disadvantageous to them collectively. So if I think I'm a worker in a job that's risky, one thing that's always been clear is that I can get a higher wage by taking a still riskier job. This is the standard Adam Smith invisible hand theorem. If you want somebody to take a job that's undesirable, you have to pay him extra to do it. So I can get extra money by taking a riskier job. Why would I want to do that? Well, if I had extra money, I could buy a bigger house. And it's my impression that if I bought a bigger house, my kids would go to a better school. It would seem neat to have a house that felt bigger. And so I do that. The rub is that when all workers do that, when everybody takes a riskier job, they all buy a bigger house, then still 10% of the kids go to bottom 10% schools. The new houses that they've bought, the bigger ones, become the norm, and so they no longer seem special or spacious as they would. And so we get a variation of the stadium metaphor. Everybody stands to get a better view of an exciting play. Nobody sees any better than if everybody had remained comfortably seated. That's how context drives decisions about spending. And so if you think about every manner of thing that societies regulate, we regulate leisure time. There are mandatory vacations, limits on the work week. Why do we do that? The traditional model explains it by, we need to restrain avaricious firms from exploiting their workers. Well, the market's pretty competitive. In fact, what will happen is if you don't limit the amount we can work, we will work longer than we think is in our interest to work. Why? Because working extra helps us get ahead in relative terms. But when everybody works extra, nobody gets ahead in relative terms. Lawyers, associates in law firms will say that they would rather have a 10% pay cut if they could get 10% fewer hours if the others would be on the same package. Would you like to do that? A 10% pay cut and 10% fewer hours? No, nobody will take that as an individual. Why? Because if you take that and the others don't, then you signal that you're not a go-getter. You're not going to be as likely to be promoted to associate in a firm like that. That's the rub. If you think about inequality, why is inequality problematic? I think we make a mistake to speak about inequality in terms of justice and fairness. Those are very hard terms to get agreement on when you have people with different points of view on the subject. They're vague, they're hard to pin down. You can think instead about the practical costs of inequality. In the United States, as elsewhere, income's been growing very rapidly at the top of the income ladder compared to further down, and so the people at the top naturally are spending more. I think there's a tendency for people to wag their fingers at, you shouldn't be spending as lavishly as you are, but every context is local. The same way my Nepali friends would be shocked at the house I live in. Some of us are shocked at the houses that the very wealthy live in, but in their context, those houses are not shocking. They're normal. The middle class, at least in the U.S., doesn't seem to get angry when they see pictures of those houses. They think they'll be rich someday. They want to see what it's going to be like when they get rich. They're mostly wrong. that they'll be rich someday, but that it doesn't seem to kindle any ill will. There's a group, though, just below the top of the income ladder. They go to the wedding receptions held at the very top tier. Now they feel they need a ballroom so that they can host their wedding reception at home the way that the top people do. There's a group that travels in the same social circles, just a notch below them. Now it's the custom in those circles to have dinner parties for 24, not 18. They need to build bigger. And so on, all the way down the income ladder. That's a process I've called expenditure cascades. Without reference to that process, it's a completely innocent process. It's the are we there yet phenomenon. It's context shaping evaluation. If you don't offer that dynamic, you can't explain why the median new house built in the United States is 50% larger than it was in 1980. The median earner doesn't earn more in real terms. Why are they spending so much more? Why is the average expenditure on weddings in the U.S. $31,000 last year? It was in real inflation-adjusted terms $10,000 in 1980. Does anybody think that people getting married last year were happier because they were spending 3 times as much on their weddings? There's evidence that, in fact, the more you spend on your wedding, the more likely you are to divorce in the succeeding years. This is money that's poorly spent. If the people who are at the top of the ladder all had less to spend, they would not suffer any ill consequences. They've got everything they need. The only question is, are they going to get what they want? What do they want? They want the things that are in short supply, the things that there aren't enough of. And how you get those things is you bid for them. And you bid against other people like you who want them, people with the same incomes and preferences you have. And if you pay a little more in tax to help fund the public sphere, and they pay a little bit more tax to pay for things in the public sphere, there will be no difference in the outcomes of the auctions that determines who get the apartments with the views of Central Park. They will go to the exact same people as before.
Thank you, Bob. I think I'm going to jump in here and ask the first question. I'm going to probably come from the angle that Niall tried to come at for a second and open up. But let me ask you just really quickly. I mean, as I heard you talking about, bigger homes, bigger weddings, I was thinking about bigger Big Macs and supersized McDonald's quarter pounders, supersized things, more French fries, more whatever. There seems to be something going on that may not, in fact, be as rational. And I guess the friendly critique question I want to ask you real quick on the kind of economics of happiness and how you've described it is I'm just wondering sometimes if economics distills things down to an impractical level. It's a kind of a backdoor to Niall's question here. When you think about love and passion and art and people wanting to be cool and hang out with cool people, and so the decision-making in my mind gets blurry because as I heard you talking about people's rational choices for this or that, I was thinking about New York City and a woman named Alexa Hirschfeld. She and her brother created the company Paperless Post. So if you get Paperless Post out there, and they're in the middle of New York City, they moved in there. It was one of the highest price areas. Living situation was very constrained, but yet they encouraged kind of a development of a corridor in New York that had the right coffee houses, the right feel, and it was very much the kind of Richard Florida notion that the rise of the creative class, this kind of cool, new, diversity-embracing crowd, makes decisions that aren't particularly economically rational when it comes from, but it's rational perhaps in other senses, which I think is very directly relevant to today's topic, which is beyond GDP essentially. And this notion of if there was a moonshot to begin looking at that, if you look at what St. Louis has tried to do of creating a creative strip, or you go around the country doing it, I'm just wondering how you folks in the hard data side of things and these kind of rational choice about 6,000 versus 8,000 square foot are looking at people walking a very different direction than your models say.
I think the psychologists have a general principle. They'll tell you it's the situation, not the person. Much of what we do is shaped by the environment we happen to find ourselves in. If you want to know if somebody's going to cheat, you look at the proportion of his coworkers who cheat on expense accounts or whatever it might be. And no individual can, by himself, shape the environment that surrounds him. And that's the consequence of 1,000 different decisions by all the individuals in the environment. And so we have an interest in the environment. There's a clear sense that we would prefer to live in an environment that would bring out the best in us rather than one that wouldn't. And when we can find practical ways to do it, we will coordinate to help bring about such environments. I think the phenomenon you're describing is one that might not have been possible before technology made the coordination problem a solvable one. There are all sorts of other ways we can do that. I think the presumption in so much of economics is that individual decisions by rational people will promote the greatest good for the greatest number just automatically. But that can't be right if each of our individual decisions shapes the environment, which in turn shapes us. We don't make our decisions with a view toward how they'll shape the environment when we're such a small contribution to that. So really the only way we can intervene in that is to act collectively. Now maybe they found ways where small numbers of people could act on a very local scale and achieve a result, but there's other things where we can change the environment only by acting on a grander scale. I'll just mention one example. I started smoking at age 14. At the time, 80% of the men in the U.S. smoked. I quit when I was 17 with some difficulty. I started up a few times, but most people who smoke wish they didn't smoke. I've never met a parent who says, my goal is to raise my kids to be smokers. No parent wants that. The fraction of people who smoke in the environment is the most important single predictor of whether your kid will smoke. I have 4 adult sons. I said once that 2 of them would be smokers, I felt for sure, if they'd grown up when I did. One of them complained and said he would have been too, so maybe 3 out of the 4 would have been smokers if they'd grown up at the time I did. Now none of them is a smoker, and the way we got there is to restructure the environment that led to their decisions about whether to be smokers. The tax on cigarettes was probably the biggest single thing, but there were many other contributors.
When I was young, and I was 1969, I was 7 years old. We had 2 kids, 3 dogs in a station wagon driving from Fairbanks, Alaska to Washington, D.C. on the mostly unpaved Alcan Highway, and it rained most of the time with 2 chain-smoking parents. That kept me from ever smoking my entire life. So I recommend it for anyone who's worried about their kids to take that trip. Let me ask you another. When I was thinking about this notion of happiness in us, and I think about decisions, and going back to my friend over here, when you think about pride and jealousy and ego and vanity and just the things that sort of seem to move at that macro level, and I'm wondering whether, because I'm actually trying to prod you here with a big poker, and as we kind of prod this notion of the weakness of the GDP and these kinds of ways to do it, what if you were to redesign a measure for decision making or a measure for how a society, as you said, measures itself from here? What would you do to tweak it? If we made you all powerful, not quite Donald Trump, but a little less, what would you do to transform the measure that so much is based on and yet so much is flawed by?
Yeah, I think
short form, because I want to go to the
audience. Yeah, I'd be inspired by some of the work of Amartya Sen, who's described,
who's written about development
functionings and capabilities. You look at indices of health and longevity, you look at literacy, you look at what can people actually do? How much time do they have?
So you'd make a dashboard of these?
Yeah, I think the happiness literature definitely does identify characteristics of living that seem to promote well-being. People who have more time for exercise each day report that they're happier in addition to being healthier. People who spend 4 weekends a month socializing with friends are happier than the people who spend one weekend. Some of this is selection bias, no doubt, but there is an attempt to control.
And just 30 seconds on luck. I mean, you didn't talk about luck. up here, but I mean, basically, as I read your stuff, it's fascinating to look at how you deal with luck. But you basically argue that most people are screwed because they're unlucky. I mean, that's the inverse of your point about luck, and that there's not, when you look at the distribution of opportunity in a society, there's just sort of a, side that's screwed through no fault of their own, and a side that's helped and benefits through no fault of their no action of their own. Tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, it's true that if you had one choice to make that would affect your whole life, the most important thing would be to choose who your parents are and when and where you're born. That explains an enormous amount of the variation in outcomes that we see around the world. But I don't think it's right to say that you're screwed if you're not lucky.
I'm just trying to make this provocative.
If you look at the people who succeed in any environment, there's variation, but most of them are very hardworking and, relatively speaking, quite talented.
Let's give a big round of applause to Professor Robert Frank.